Okay, so we are in week 2 of the Middle Sister Sew-Along. We are going to talk all things cutting. First, you'll need your fabric. So you'll need my backing. If you're making a layer cake throw size, you really only need 36 10-inch squares. Because I don't know my layout, I don't know how many pinks I'll want or greens I'll want, I'm gonna make them all over make the half square triangle. So I'm gonna do these 42, which means I'll cut the 42 back with all the strips in between. And yeah, so we'll get to that in a second. You'll need your rotary cutter. I recommend changing out the blade. I feel like all new projects deserve a new blade. You'll need a quilting ruler. I use this one a lot for cutting down big pieces of yards. It's Creative Grid. I use a Creative Grid across the board. Again, I feel like it helps your efficiency when you're really familiar with your rulers. So this is a 6.5 by 24.5. I also use this guy, which I actually don't know the name of it, but I will link it here. And it suctions to your ruler. So the clips are open. You drop it down, push down, close the clips. And now you can just hang on to this instead of trying to shuffle your ruler around. Again, it helps with really big pieces of fabric. Lastly, my favorite, if you've been around, you've definitely heard me talk about this. It's a Stripology ruler. This is the XL size. They come in multiple size based off of pricing and what maybe you want to do with it. Creative Grid, just all the way. I'll kind of do a demo on cutting with this, but there's slits at every half mark. So if you're working on a project that deals with a lot of 1/4 inch cutting, like you need 2 1/4, this is not going to work for you. It needs to be at least a 1/2 inch, but I will definitely get to that. Then we want to make sure all of our fabric is pressed and ready to go. Now, my favorite pressing tools, I have this wool mat just for the demo itself. But Aliso irons, they have the eye touch. So when you release the handle, I'll kind of set it sideways so you can see. Feet come out. That way when you let it sit on its own, you can always sit it horizontal and it's not going to burn anything. I have a link below for Aliso irons. It is an affiliate code. I get a very small amount of commission, but regardless, I would recommend this quilt or this iron, regardless of the link or not. So those are the tools you need. Now let's get into ironing and I'll be back. Okay, so most of these I've ironed just a gentle touch. This was curled up in a ball. So I'm going to just kind of get the kink out right here. I'm just gonna do it all these fabrics at once. I'm not gonna use a spray or anything, and press this out. These irons get really hot, so I really like them, and I'm just gonna flip over and do the other side. And I'm gonna call that good. So I'm gonna set it up just because of the board. So I would say these are done. Now I'm gonna do my background fabric. All right, so before I start cutting, I make sure of 2 things. One, that I'm following the right instructions based off of what I'm making. So there's 2 versions, color burst or minimalist, and there's 2 sizes, lap or throw. There's also wall hanging and pillow, but we're assuming we're not doing that for the sew along. So make sure we go, I'm doing color burst throw. My backing is going to be 3.5 yards. Perfect. I did that. I ironed that. So make sure when you go into the cutting instructions, you're looking at the right one. Okay. So quilt math. Again, we have a total of 3.5 yards. So let's zoom in. Bear with me. If I share this and it's not clicking, or you're like, no, Katie, that's fine. We can move on. So before you even cut, pre-cutting, I look at the math. So I look at my first number, which is the width by fabric. And then you have the subcut, ignore the subcut, just do width of fabric. So again, for the background, I'm gonna write that here. Background, throw, color burst, background, which is L, is this. I'm going to say we have 10-inch width by fabric. 10 by 10 is 100, okay? Then I'm gonna say, how can I cut 100 inches? Because 100 inches is huge, it's gonna go off your table, right? So how can I break down 100 inches to keep it on my table? Again, my mat is 36 inches long, which is a yard. So I can do a 30-inch, a 30-inch, and a 40-inch. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Perfect, that's 100. 40 inch is gonna be a little bit long, but it's only one of them, and we'll make it work, right? So that's the first part. The second part is we have 21-inch strips. 20 times 1 is 20. 20 is smaller than 36, which is smaller than the yard, smaller than my table, so I could totally cut a 20-inch, and that's perfect. Now, we want to see, okay, well, how much wiggle room do we have in the pattern that Katie wrote? Again, for what I'm following, I have 3.5 yards that I purchased, okay, based off of the instructions. So 10 plus 20 is 120 inches. That divided by 36, which is the inches in yards, is 3.333. So 0.333 is a third. 3 1/3 of yard is what I need to make this quilt. I bought 3.5, so I have 6 inches to spare. Katie, how did you do that? Well, half a yard in inches is 18, and a third is 12. 18 minus 12 is 6. Okay, I say that because when I come up and I cut a 30-inch, a 30-inch, and a 40-inch, I'm gonna give myself a little bit of wiggle room, because when you fold it, it has to be straight, you cut on the bias, like all that jazz. Well, we won't be cutting on the bias, but I'll get to that in a second. We wanna add just a little bit and increase all these just a tad. So I'll probably do like 31, 31, 41, and then here I'll probably do 21. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 extra inches I'm gonna use. So take that information for what you want. This is how I break down yardage, because we have, again, 3.5 yards. It's a lot of fabric. It can be overwhelming. So again, I'm gonna cut it in 31, 31, 41, and then 21, and cut this down. I'm using layer cake, so all my 10-inch squares are cut for my A through K. Cool? So I'm gonna set those aside and get my back. Okay, so again, quilt math. If this is too confusing, feel free to ignore it. My first instruction is to cut 10-inch by the width of the fabric, okay? So I'm gonna do, that's 100 inches, which can be a lot, right? So I decided to do 30, 30, and 40. And I'm gonna increase it just a little bit. So I'm gonna do like 31. 31 and 40. And I'm gonna do each one of those and then I'm gonna subcut, okay? So let's just do the 31. So first I need to get selvage to selvage. So selvage usually has some writing on it, or it can look like this with just like a little bit of fray. We want to use this to help us cut straight, but we don't necessarily want to include it in our quilts, though some people do, and that makes for some really pretty designs. Okay, so again, I have all this fabric and I'm going to cut it up using my method to help me so I don't get overwhelmed. But the important part when you do that is to make sure you have the room. We decided we have 6 inches of spare fabric. Not all patterns write that, and I can't guarantee all the patterns I wrote are like that. So what I do is I'm doing selvage to selvage, and I'm kind of putting it in the air and making sure that this edge is laying flat. An example of it not laying flat would be this. It crinkles. So we want it to be lined up at the top, but also laying flat. So there we go. And I'm gonna cut 31 inches. Okay, so I'm gonna use the suction and my ruler and my rotary blade. And I'm gonna go about 31, I said, to make sure I have enough room. Perfect. So what's my goal here? My goal is to cut 3 10-inch by width of fabric. All right. So I feel confident that this is straight already. I'm going to take the fold end and fold it away from me, aligning with the top of my selvage. Bring it down a little bit. Now, I'm gonna use my favorite tool I have ever found in the quilting world. These are 10-inch strips. So I'm only gonna be able to get 2 at a time, okay? But this, if you watch some demos for my Astra quilt, when we make smaller pieces, this just saves so much time, but I will show you how I use it. So I'm gonna come over, let's kind of zoom in. Do edge to edge. So this is my straight edge that I'm saying. I've measured. I'm gonna kind of come over here because you wanna make sure you get all the layers. In my case, I always cut with 4 layers. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm gonna line it up about here. Take a straight edge of the ruler, not your mat. So the ruler that you're adding to your quilting ruler. I use the black lines because I see them better. Make them straight all the way across. Boom, I'm good with that. Now, I'm going to start with 0. And cut off the edge, which I just messed this up, but that's okay. So, and then I'm gonna cut at the 10, and then I'm gonna cut at the 20. Okay, so now I have, zoom back out, 10-inch, 10-inch. I'm gonna set those aside. Okay, so I'm going to cut 21-inch strips, or however many this is, and then I'll get my other piece. If you remember, I had an oops earlier. Which also is just why you cut the larger pieces first, no matter how the pattern's written. Again, 0, I'm gonna cut on my left, making sure all 4 pieces are underneath there. And then I'm going to cut on the bottom, or I'm gonna make sure it's straight on the bottom. So I'm doing 1-inch strips, just like the pattern says. So I'm gonna cut every 1 inch. Okay, now we're gonna work on subcuts. So these are my 10-inch squares, or sorry, these are my 10-inch strips. So 10 inches by width of fabric. So I'm going to lay each one out in a half. Another quick math for this project is, how many 10-inch squares can you get in 42 inches? And that's 4. So we're gonna have 2 and 2 because again, this is duplicated. It's doubled up underneath, the fabric is. So I'm going to make sure the layers are straight and I'm leaning it against the ruler of the mat. This is one of the times I use the ruler of the mat, okay? Again, I'm gonna take this and kind of line it up then on that next line. Line this up on the next line. You can see I'm kind of making my edges be as close to even as possible. The less you move fabric when you're cutting, the better. So if you don't want to do this method, that's fine. All right, so now I have 2, 4, 6, 8. I have 8 layers, so keep that in mind when we cut this, okay? So again, I'm gonna use my Stripology. We're only cutting 4, so we only need to the 20, which is just looking roughly good for us. I'm going to cut at the straight line. So I'm gonna line up this black line at the bottom. And again, I'm gonna look for my 0 and line it to the left as possible to make sure we have enough room. It looks good to me. Now we just gotta make sure it doesn't move nor cut our fingers. So I'm gonna cut at the 0. I'm gonna kind of go back and forth because it is 8 pieces of fabric. Then I'm gonna come to the 10 and do the same thing. Okay, and then I'm gonna come to the 20 and do the same thing. All right, so we should have 16 10-inch blocks. And that is my favorite way to cut fabric. And we're gonna do the next group. Okay. So we're gonna cut the 1-inch strips down. Per instructions, you're setting 2 of them aside, so I'm gonna do that. And then we're gonna have 2 at 37.5. Again, remember, I'm following the throw color burst. So I'm gonna use 2, and this is another example of me. I'm gonna use the mat. So I'm gonna set it straight against my line on the ruler of the mat. And then I'm gonna take the next one. So I'm cutting .37 inches. So I'm gonna use just a small little ruler and cut. Okay, well, I'm gonna cut this way because something's in the way. Note, you can cut these a little bit bigger and trim because these are the ones that are going to be your the small sashing. So if you want to cut them a little bit bigger, that's okay. It's not in the instructions, but you can do that. So I'm going to bring this down, and then I'm going to get out another ruler. I should have done this beforehand, but I didn't. Okay, so that's at the half. Perfect. So let's make sure these are straight and they moved. So another way to do this is 37.5 divided by 2, and then measure that out. It's another way to do this. So I'm gonna roughly cut these. So 36, 37.5. I'm gonna do in 3/4 just to make sure we have enough room. And slice those suckers. And we'll be done with that extra mat. So here's my 37.5. Okay, so note, when I cut my fabric, we have these letterings. Now I don't need A through K because of the layer cake that I'm using. L is pretty obvious, but I'm really just gonna use it for the smaller strips here, so I can keep track of L1 through L5. So I'm just gonna kind of show you how I do this. If I was cutting all of them, I like to use this little cutter, cutting mat. So I'm gonna cut out the ones I need. Okay, and then I'm gonna just set those aside because I don't need those. Then I'm just gonna cut these guys. These are the 2 strips I set aside, and those are L2. So I'm just gonna do L2 and take a clip and clip those. And then these were my 37.5, which are L3s. Clip those, set aside. And now I need to cut these, and then I will do the same clipping method. Okay, so following along, I need 8 33.5 for L4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Really, it's a 1-to-1 for this. So I'm gonna do 1 with the fabric. So I'm again going to use my board for 33. So I'm gonna line each one of these up and we'll come back. Okay, so I have all 8 laid out. I'm gonna use a smaller ruler. You can use the bigger one, I guess, so it catches everything. So I'm going to gently do this over here, slightly backwards, because this thing is in the way. Make sure I got all those before I pick this up. Perfect. Triple check when I'm measuring or when I'm cutting, which is 33.5. I'm gonna do 33 and like a little bit extra. So I'm gonna do 33 and like 3/4 or something. Cool. So I'm going to now gather these strips, fold it in half, and clip it with the label. Okay, now we're gonna cut the last strip, which is L5. In my instance, we need 24 12.5 strips. So we need to see how many 12.5 we're gonna cut within the width of fabric. Width of fabric is 42 inches. 42 divided by 12.5 is 3.5. We're gonna get 3 12.5 per strip. So to do that, I am going to keep them in half and just do a few at a time. Looks good. I'm just gonna do this bottom one. I don't trust that one. So I'm gonna do 0, 12.5 and leave this folded for right now. Okay, then I'm gonna set that aside. So this is 2. Then I'm gonna open this up and I can either do 12.5 with my Stripology, or I can get a smaller ruler and do 12.5. So that is how I would then cut. I would cut all my L5. And then these are scraps. So that's 3. That's how I would do that. Okay, so I just got done cutting all my L5s. I'm going to clip it. I thought I had a clip. And then there we go. So I'm now done with all my cutting. L5, L4, L3, L2, and my L1s. And here's all my A through K. So the thing I would say, my biggest tips are cut the larger pieces first. And if you have any questions with the pre-cutting quilt math, let me know.